The street was unusually quiet that morning. Even the distant hum of traffic seemed muted, as if the city itself was holding its breath. A lone man swept the pavement, moving slowly, methodically, with a rhythm that suggested both patience and habit. His clothes were worn, his shoes dusty, and his posture humble. Most people passed without a glance. To them he was invisible, just another street worker doing his job. But some people notice what they want to notice, and sometimes they notice the wrong things. A sleek black SUV rolled to a stop a few meters away. The engine hummed, low and commanding, drawing attention. The tinted windows reflected the sunlight, giving the car a cold, almost arrogant presence. The door opened and a well-dressed man stepped out, his shoes clicking against the concrete, his tie slightly askew as if he hadn't expected resistance. He looked down at the street sweeper with a mixture of irritation and contempt. "You're blocking the entrance," the man snapped sharply, his tone leaving no room for discussion. The sweeper didn't react. He continued moving the broom with quiet precision, sweeping dust in smooth arcs. His calmness was almost unnerving. Before anyone could intervene, the man reached out and slapped the broom from the sweeper's hands. A sudden sharp sound cut through the quiet morning. People nearby froze, unsure how to respond. Some instinctively looked for a police officer. Others just stared, mouth slightly open, surprised at the audacity. But the sweeper didn't flinch. He didn't shout. He didn't make a scene. He simply looked up, slow, measured, eyes calm yet piercing. A subtle presence radiated from him, quiet, commanding, impossible to ignore. The bully had no idea who he was facing. To him, this was just a poor man, defenseless and weak, someone he could intimidate with ease. But appearances are often deceiving. This man, simple as he seemed, held a past that few could imagine. A life defined by discipline, precision, and unshakable calm. A life that demanded respect, not from force but from mastery of mind and body. And as the SUV's engine idled impatiently, the air seemed to shift. Passers-by felt it too. That strange tension that comes when someone underestimated becomes someone impossible to ignore. Because the man holding the broom was not just a street sweeper. He was a legend quietly walking among ordinary people. The man with the broom continued sweeping, his movements slow, almost meditative. The morning sun caught the dust rising from the street, creating tiny shimmering clouds around him. To the casual observer, he was nothing more than a simple street sweeper, performing a humble task. But those who looked closely, really looked, could sense something different. There was a calm precision in the way he moved, a quiet confidence that seemed to belong to someone who had seen and survived far more than ordinary life could offer. The SUV's door closed with a sharp thud. The well-dressed man took a step forward, adjusting his cufflinks with a flick of irritation. He was used to getting his way, used to being the center of attention, used to people bending to his will without question. And yet, there was something unsettling in the sweeper's calm gaze. "You lost, old man?" the man sneered, smirking as he stepped closer. "This is private property. Move along before I call someone." The words were meant to intimidate, but the sweeper didn't flinch. He didn't even pause in his work. Instead, he adjusted the broom with deliberate care, tilting it slightly as if to align it with some invisible rhythm. Every gesture was purposeful, deliberate, and almost hypnotic in its steadiness. Around them, the street seemed to hold its breath. A few early morning pedestrians slowed their pace, sensing tension without knowing why. Birds chirped, but their song felt distant, overshadowed by the silent power emanating from the man with the broom. Years ago, he had been known in circles far from this quiet street. Police officers, martial arts instructors, and law enforcement specialists had whispered about him with a mixture of awe and respect. He had trained countless officers in observation, discipline, and control. His reputation wasn't built on fame or flashy accolades. It was built on results, precision, and calm under pressure. Now, though, in these worn clothes, with a simple broom in hand, he looked ordinary. Weak even. The bully didn't see a man of legend. He saw an easy target. That misjudgment was common. People often equate quietness with weakness, simplicity with insignificance, and patience with fear. The sweeper, however, knew exactly what he was facing. He observed the bully with subtle attention, taking in every gesture, every micro-expression. The angle of the man's shoulders. The way his jaw tensed. The shallow rhythm of his breathing. Each detail told a story of overconfidence, entitlement, and impatience. And in the sweeper's mind, he was already planning a response, not with aggression but with control. The man's companions, seeing him act boldly, smirked and chuckled. They were drawn by group arrogance, the false security of numbers. 7 people together, ready to assert dominance over one. That was the pattern they relied on. But the sweeper didn't see 7 people. He saw 7 predictable reactions, 7 bodies ready to be guided by subtle awareness and calm. "You don't look like much," the leader muttered, almost to himself. "Just a man in old clothes." The sweeper finally spoke, voice low but firm, carrying calm authority. "Appearances can be deceiving." The words were simple. There was no threat, no shouting, no attempt to escalate. But in them, the quiet weight of experience was unmistakable. The kind of experience that commands attention without demanding it. For a moment, the bully's smirk faltered. Not because he recognized the sweeper's past, but because he felt the shift in presence. Subtle, silent, undeniable. Those who are truly disciplined don't need to show power. They radiate it, and it changes the dynamic in a room, a street, or a confrontation. The sweeper continued his work, eyes calmly scanning, hands steady, posture unshaken. And in that steady rhythm, there was a lesson no one else could give. Patience and awareness are more powerful than arrogance and noise. For the bully, the street was no longer a playground. For the spectators, it became a lesson in perception. And for the sweeper, it was just another day, a day to demonstrate that real strength does not seek approval, does not demand respect, and does not need to shout to be noticed. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the quiet street. Pedestrians had begun to take notice of the scene unfolding, slowing their pace as a sense of tension grew in the air. The sweeper continued his task, sweeping dust in slow, methodical arcs, each motion precise, deliberate. He didn't speak. He didn't flinch. Yet, the presence he exuded seemed to fill the entire street. The businessman's companions whispered among themselves, nudging each other, trying to hide their unease behind laughter. "What a weak old man," one muttered, loud enough for the sweeper to hear. Another bumped into him playfully, testing boundaries. "Say something, will you?" They jeered, expecting a reaction, a shout, perhaps even a sign of fear. But the sweeper remained composed. Not a muscle twitched. Not a hint of aggression showed on his face. Every nudge, every insult, every mocking gesture was being observed, measured, and catalogued. The silence was almost deafening. The leader, growing impatient, stepped closer. He cracked his knuckles, a sharp sound that seemed intended to echo authority, to demand fear. "You think you can just stand there?" he said, smirk twisting across his face. "You're not worth anyone's respect." The sweeper looked up slowly, his gaze calm and unwavering. He didn't smile. He didn't sneer. He didn't raise his voice. Yet something in that stillness unsettled the group. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't anger. It was control, the kind of control that comes from years of mastering oneself, knowing exactly when to move, when to speak, when to act. A subtle shift occurred in the street's energy. Passers-by could feel it even if they couldn't explain why. The bully's smirk faltered for a split second. His companions noticed it too, but tried to dismiss it, laughing louder, gesturing boldly. Yet the more they tried, the more the sweeper's calm dominance seemed to grow. One of the businessmen pushed a trash bin toward him, a cheap act meant to provoke. "Move," he barked. The sweeper's response was measured. He lifted the bin gently, returning it to its place without a word. The action was simple, almost mundane. Yet in it, the silent message was unmistakable. "I am in control. You are not." Confidence, once oozing from the group like an invisible shield, began to erode. Their laughter sounded hollow. Their bold gestures lost some of their intended intimidation. They had underestimated him, and underestimated him badly. The leader finally spoke again, voice sharp but tinged with uncertainty. You're not afraid of us?" The sweeper shook his head subtly. "Fear doesn't control me," he said softly, deliberately. "And arrogance can be very costly." A hush fell over the street. Even the sunlight seemed to pause, lingering on the faces of the spectators. For the first time, the group realized that this wasn't a man to bully. This was someone who had spent a lifetime perfecting awareness, patience, and discipline. Someone who could respond to any situation without chaos, without violence, yet with absolute authority. And suddenly the dynamic shifted. The crowd began to lean in, watching, mesmerized. The businessmen's confidence wavered. Their arrogance, once a visible cloak of power, was now thin and fragile. The sweeper continued sweeping, unhurried, each stroke deliberate, each motion a demonstration of calm mastery. It was a subtle reminder that real power doesn't shout. It radiates. And in this quiet, seemingly ordinary street, the balance of power was being rewritten. not with fists or threats, but with composure, awareness, and discipline. The tension on the street had grown almost unbearable. The businessman and his companions stood frozen, their earlier laughter and bravado long gone. Even the pedestrians had stopped, forming an invisible circle around the unfolding scene, sensing that something extraordinary was about to happen. Every eye was on the man with the broom, whose calm presence seemed to dominate the entire street. The sweeper paused mid-motion, leaning slightly on his broom. The sunlight caught his eyes, revealing a quiet intensity that few could mistake for weakness. His voice, when he spoke, was soft but carried a weight far beyond its volume. "Enough," he said. The word was simple, almost understated. Yet in it was the authority of someone who had seen conflict and emerged unshaken countless times. The businessman opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. He felt a strange hesitation he had never experienced before. At that moment, a police patrol car turned the corner, engine humming softly. Two officers stepped out, noting the tension immediately. But as soon as their eyes fell on the sweeper, their steps faltered. Their posture straightened. A quiet respect replaced casual indifference. "Sir," one of the officers said, his voice barely above a whisper. The businessman's eyes widened in disbelief. "Sir? You mean?" he stammered, suddenly unsure. The officer nodded subtly. "He trained half of our department. Tactical operations, observation, discipline. You have no idea who you're dealing with." The street fell completely silent. The spectators shifted uncomfortably, their curiosity now tinged with awe. The businessman's smirk had vanished entirely, replaced by confusion and a sudden, heavy awareness of his own arrogance. The sweeper, still calm, lifted his gaze and looked directly at the businessman. There was no malice, no threat, only quiet confidence and measured composure. "Appearances can be deceiving," he said again, this time with a slight, knowing nod. The truth landed harder than any slap, louder than any shouting. A man who had seemed ordinary, weak, and unremarkable was in fact a legend among those trained to observe, to control, to survive. Every step, every gesture, every calculated breath over the years had prepared him for moments like this. And now, in a quiet street, he demonstrated that strength is not in force but in mastery of oneself. The businessman's companions exchanged nervous glances. Their bravado, once unshakable, was crumbling in real time. The arrogance that had made them bold enough to provoke, to mock, to push boundaries, evaporated like mist under the morning sun. "Sir," one of them finally murmured, voice shaky, we didn't know." The sweeper didn't shout. He didn't demand an apology. He simply continued sweeping, slow, deliberate, steady. And in that simple act, he communicated more than words ever could. Respect is earned through presence, not intimidation. Authority is demonstrated, not claimed. The businessman swallowed hard. The heat of embarrassment burned in his cheeks. For the first time that morning, he realized that arrogance has limits, and that humility is often the first lesson learned in the presence of true mastery. Onlookers, once mere spectators, now felt the impact of the reveal. Some whispered to each other, others simply stared, captivated by the subtle power on display. There was a lesson unfolding silently, and everyone present was absorbing it without a single word of threat or violence. The sweeper finally straightened, broom in hand, and cast one last glance at the businessman. "Strength," he said softly, "is measured not by how loud you act, but by how composed you remain when others try to make you react." The crowd collectively exhaled. The street, once tense, seemed to return to its ordinary rhythm. But the lesson remained: appearances are misleading. Assumptions can be dangerous. And real power doesn't need to shout to be recognized. The businessman, humbled, lowered his head. He understood now that he had misjudged someone who, in reality, was more capable in a quiet moment than he could ever imagine in a loud display of force. The sweeper returned to his work with calm dignity. Every stroke of the broom, every deliberate movement, now carried the weight of revelation. Not just to the businessman but to everyone watching. True strength is quiet, steady, and undeniable. The morning sun continued to climb, casting long shadows over the quiet street where the confrontation had unfolded. Pedestrians lingered at the edges, unsure whether to resume their routines or simply continue watching. The businessman and his companions stood frozen, still grappling with the revelation that the man they had mocked and provoked was far more capable than they had imagined. Their bravado, once so loud and assured, had melted into silence. The sweeper, calm and deliberate, continued his work. Every movement, each sweep of the broom, each turn of his body, was precise, measured, and purposeful. It was almost hypnotic. To the casual eye, it looked like ordinary street cleaning. But to anyone paying attention, it was a demonstration of something far deeper, the quiet discipline that underlies true strength. The businessman finally attempted to regain his composure. You can't stop all of us," he stammered, voice cracking slightly. There was a trace of panic now, a crack in the facade of confidence he had worn so easily just moments before. The sweeper didn't respond with anger or threat. He merely shook his head slowly, eyes steady. "Real strength," he said softly, "isn't about stopping anyone. It's not about dominance, intimidation, or numbers. Strength is measured in calmness, awareness, and self-control. It's knowing when to act, when to speak, and when to let situations unfold. Arrogance is temporary. Discipline lasts forever." The words settled over the group like a gentle weight. It was not a lecture. It was not a rebuke. It was a revelation. Those who had relied on force and intimidation now understood, viscerally, that those tools could never replace mastery of self. One of the businessman's companions whispered, almost to himself, He could have humiliated us." The sweeper's voice remained calm, controlled, and deliberate. "I didn't need to. The lesson is not in humiliation. The lesson is in understanding the consequences of arrogance and underestimating others. True power is shown in how you handle yourself, not in how you make others feel small." The businessman looked down at the ground, shame and awareness mingling in equal measure. He had thought himself powerful because of wealth, numbers, and influence. He had assumed that a quiet, seemingly ordinary man would cower, would submit, would be easily intimidated. He had been wrong, spectacularly wrong. Around them, the street felt different. Pedestrians who had been watching quietly began to understand the deeper truth. Intimidation may work in the short term, but it fades quickly. Discipline, patience, and awareness endure. Even the children playing nearby seemed to sense it, pausing their games to watch the sweeper's measured movements. The sweeper paused and straightened. He cast one calm glance at the group of men, his presence alone enough to command attention. Numbers, noise, and outward displays of power can give a false sense of control, he said. But the real measure of strength, the true lesson of mastery, is in how you respond when no one else can protect you, when no one else is watching, when it matters most. The businessman's companions shifted uncomfortably, a silent acknowledgement that their assumptions had been naive. They had relied on aggression and visibility, thinking that their confidence alone could impose control. But now they understood that true control is invisible, subtle, and undeniable. One of the men finally spoke, voice low and hesitant. We didn't realize." The sweeper gave a subtle nod, continuing his work with the same calm precision. "It's easy to underestimate people," he said, "especially those who appear quiet, unassuming, or ordinary. But remember this, everyone has their own strength. And sometimes the quietest person in the room holds the most power, not because they seek it but because they don't need to prove it." For the first time, the businessman truly looked at the sweeper. He saw the steadiness, the patience, the mastery in every motion. He realized that power isn't about what you show, it's about what you control within yourself. The street, once filled with tension, now felt reflective. Even the air seemed lighter, carrying the weight of lessons learned without conflict. The sweeper's calm demonstration had shifted something in everyone present. They had witnessed something rare, a confrontation resolved without violence, without humiliation, and without chaos, yet every observer left with a lesson they wouldn't forget. The sweeper lifted the broom one final time and smiled faintly, almost imperceptibly. "Respect," he said softly, "is not given because of wealth, status, or numbers. It is earned through patience, awareness, and calm action. Never forget that." The group of men remained silent, humbled, and reflective. The lesson had been delivered, quietly, steadily, and without a single raised hand. They understood that real strength lies not in forcing submission, but in showing the consequences of arrogance with dignity and awareness. Pedestrians resumed their routines, but their steps were quieter, more thoughtful. The street had returned to normal, but the memory of what had happened lingered. The lesson was clear. Arrogance may feel powerful, but discipline lasts. Confidence built on intimidation crumbles. And those who underestimate others do so at their own peril. The street had fallen into an uneasy calm. The businessman and his companions, once brimming with arrogance, now stood in silence. Their earlier confidence had dissolved like mist under the morning sun. Each man's chest rose and fell unevenly, betraying the tension and embarrassment they were trying, and failing, to conceal. The sweeper, calm and composed, had returned to his task. Yet there was a subtle change in his posture. His movements were still slow and measured, but now there was a quiet finality in his gestures, a sense that the lesson was reaching its natural conclusion. He did not rush. He did not shout. He simply existed in a space of absolute control, and that presence alone was enough to command attention. The businessman tried to speak, hesitating as the weight of reality pressed down on him. I didn't realize. I thought. His words trailed off. He wanted to assert himself, to reclaim some shred of authority, but every instinct told him that here, in the presence of someone so utterly disciplined, words were powerless. The sweeper lifted his broom, placing it against the pavement with deliberate care. He straightened fully, standing in the soft morning light, a figure of quiet authority. Then, with a subtle, almost imperceptible motion, he gestured toward his broom. Not aggressively. Not threateningly. But in that single gesture there was meaning. No one needed to be harmed, he said calmly, voice steady, measured. No one needed to be humiliated. But lessons must be understood. You chose disrespect. You assumed weakness. And now you've seen the consequences. The businessmen glanced at each other, finally noticing the truth in the sweeper's words. The consequences were not physical. There had been no confrontation, no violence, no shouting, only a shift in perception, a demonstration of true authority. In that moment they understood something profound. Strength does not announce itself. It is revealed through calm action, patience, and awareness. The sweeper then walked slowly toward his motorcycle, parked a few meters away. Every step was deliberate, controlled, and unhurried. His movements conveyed confidence without arrogance, authority without threat. When he reached it, he lifted the machine upright effortlessly, the weight of it seemingly nothing to him. Onlookers felt the subtle power of the action, a reminder that true strength is often hidden, manifesting only when necessary. The businessman's companions took a cautious step back. The initial crowd that had been watching now stood silently, captivated by the unfolding lesson. They had seen arrogance dissolve without a single punch, without a shout, without a display of violence. And they were beginning to understand that real power lies in control, not chaos. The sweeper mounted his motorcycle, gloves tightening over the handles. His dark sunglasses reflected the sun, hiding his eyes but amplifying his calm, commanding presence. He looked back at the businessman one final time. "Remember this," he said, voice steady, deliberate. "Confidence built on intimidation is temporary. Discipline and calm last forever. Never mistake quiet for weakness. And never underestimate someone simply because they seem ordinary." With that, he started the engine. The low rumble of the motorcycle cut through the quiet street like a measured heartbeat, steady and deliberate. Dust rose gently behind him as he pulled away, leaving the group in silence, reflective, humbled, and transformed. The businessman swallowed hard, a new understanding dawning. He had entered the street believing he held power. He had mocked, provoked, and assumed dominance. But the sweeper had shown, without aggression, without spectacle, that real authority does not rely on numbers, noise, or appearances. Pedestrians slowly resumed their routines, but their steps carried a subtle reverence. Even the children playing nearby seemed quieter, somehow aware that they had witnessed something unusual, a demonstration of power that relied not on fear but on presence, awareness, and discipline. The sweeper disappeared down the street, dust trailing behind him like a silent testament to the lesson he had imparted. The businessman and his companions remained where they were, absorbing the magnitude of what had just occurred. The arrogance that had driven them to act so boldly was gone, replaced by a cautious respect and a newfound understanding of humility. In that quiet street, one simple truth had been made clear. Strength is measured not by force, but by the composure to act wisely when others seek to provoke you. And for those who had watched, it was a lesson that would linger long after the street had returned to its ordinary rhythm. The street had returned to its quiet rhythm, yet the air seemed charged with the memory of what had just unfolded. Pedestrians moved slowly, eyes still occasionally flicking toward the spot where the confrontation had taken place. Children resumed their games, but there was a subtle attentiveness in their steps, as if they had just witnessed a lesson far greater than any words could convey. The businessman and his companions remained frozen for a moment longer, a heavy silence settling around them. Their faces betrayed a mix of humility, shock, and awe. They had thought themselves in control, believing that status, numbers, and aggression could dictate the world around them. But the sweeper, the quiet, unassuming man who had seemed ordinary at first glance, had demonstrated a truth far more powerful. Real authority comes from within. The sweeper, now mounted on his motorcycle, paused for a moment at the edge of the street. He looked back once, surveying the small crowd that had gathered. His dark sunglasses reflected the morning light, hiding his eyes but amplifying the calm, commanding presence that had left such a deep impression. There was no boast, no challenge, no demand for recognition. Only quiet mastery. He started the engine, the low rumble echoing softly down the street. Dust lifted gently behind him, drifting in the sunlight like a subtle signature of his departure. The motorcycle moved with effortless precision, each turn and acceleration deliberate, yet unhurried. It was a final demonstration. Strength does not need to rush, it does not need to shout. True power is calm, controlled, and enduring. The businessman finally spoke, voice low, hesitant, but carrying the weight of understanding. I didn't know, he admitted. I misjudged you. The sweeper's reply was quiet, almost a whisper carried on the breeze. Appearances are often deceiving. And arrogance always teaches a lesson. He didn't linger. There was nothing more to say. His actions, calm and composed, had already spoken volumes. The companions exchanged glances. They had arrived with the confidence of those who believed themselves untouchable, yet now they understood the fragility of arrogance. They had relied on external power, wealth, status, numbers, only to discover that true influence comes from inner discipline, observation, and measured action. The spectators, previously curious onlookers, now began to process the deeper message. Some whispered to each other, discussing the subtle power of patience and self-control. Others simply watched the sweeper disappear down the street, recognizing that lessons do not need to be loud to leave a lasting impact. The street itself seemed transformed. It was no longer just a place of mundane routine. It had become a stage for a demonstration of mastery, a reminder that strength is not always visible, and that respect is earned through calm action, not through intimidation. For the businessman and his companions, the encounter would linger in their minds long after the sweeper had left. They had learned, perhaps for the first time, that confidence built on fear or force is fleeting, while discipline and awareness endure. Every gesture, every measured motion, every quiet word of the sweeper had imparted a lesson they would not forget. Even the children playing nearby seemed to carry the lesson in their eyes. They had observed a man who could have responded with anger or aggression, yet chose restraint and composure instead. They had seen someone whose quiet strength commanded respect without ever needing to assert it physically. In those subtle details, a profound truth was revealed. Power is not about domination, it is about understanding, control, and the ability to act wisely under pressure. As the sweeper disappeared around the corner, a small wind lifted the dust behind him, scattering it across the street like a final, invisible mark of the encounter. The lesson had been delivered, not through force, not through humiliation, but through presence and mastery. Every observer had absorbed it differently, but all understood its weight. The businessman finally lowered his gaze, humbled and reflective. He had walked into the street full of arrogance, certain of his dominance, only to discover that assumptions could be dangerous. The sweeper had shown him that real strength is quiet, enduring, and often hidden in plain sight. Meanwhile, the crowd slowly dispersed, carrying with them an unspoken recognition. Appearances are misleading, and those who seem ordinary may carry extraordinary power. The encounter had left a mark, not a visible scar, not a public spectacle, but a subtle, lasting impression of what discipline and awareness can achieve. In the quiet aftermath, the sweeper's words echoed silently in the minds of those who had witnessed him. Respect is earned through patience and calm. Strength is demonstrated through awareness and composure. Arrogance fades, but discipline endures. And in that truth, the final lesson crystallized for everyone present. It is not force that commands respect, but wisdom, self-control, and quiet mastery of oneself. The street, once ordinary and unnoticed, had become a testament to the power of subtlety and restraint. The sweeper was gone, yet his presence remained, a reminder that true strength does not need to be seen to be felt, and that the quietest people often leave the deepest impressions. Speech balloon. Do you think the businessman truly learned his lesson? Thumbs up like if you believe calmness is more powerful than aggression. Repeat button. Share with someone who underestimates quiet, disciplined people.